Welcome back, everybody. Mike here once again with the second part of the video lecture series on J.L. Austin's book, How to Do Things with Words. In the first video, we talked about Lecture 1 and Lecture 2. Today, we'll be covering Lecture 3. So let's continue where our discussion left off. In Lecture 3, Austin wants to add yet another distinction. He says there are explicit performatives and there are implicit performatives. Now, to Austin, I pronounce you married is an explicit performative. When it's pulled off correctly in a highly conventionalized setting, it's a performative utterance that does exactly what it says it's going to do. Now, let's think of an example of an implicit performative utterance. So let's say we're walking and we get to a crosswalk, and I turn to my friend and say, there's a car coming. A couple things happened here. I defined or described the situation. There is a car coming, a true statement. But also, when I said that, my friend suddenly stopped walking. They realized, oh, I don't want to be hit by a car right now because that shit hurts and I don't have health insurance, so that's a problem. So I described what was happening in the world. But also, my statement acted as a warning to my friend to be careful, which had the effect of them looking up, seeing a car coming, stopping, and then having a whole bunch of thoughts and feelings. That's how my performative phrase affected the context and acted upon the world. So notice the difference between the performative phrase, I pronounce you married, which is explicitly acting upon the world in the way that it says it's going to act upon the world. But according to Austin, in the phrase, there's a car coming, the performative aspect is implied, or that this phrase is an implicit performative. Because according to Austin, you can draw out the performative aspect of this piece of language, which might be something like, stop walking, there's a car coming. But what if my friend had already seen the car coming, or just thinks that I talk way too much? Did action take place? Yeah. Was it happy action? Wait though, to be happy, doesn't the performative utterance have to be highly conventional and ordinary and explicit? Did the phrase, there's a car coming, fulfill all those conditions if my friend already saw that there was a car coming? So we're kind of seeing a pattern here. Every time Austin introduces a new distinction, they end up relying on assumptions made elsewhere in his theory. And in this case, we end up getting into this whole long conversation about what is conventional. And here's what I mean. If I'm at a crosswalk in New York, and someone yells at me, there's a car coming, I know to stop walking, which kind of tells me that this is a highly conventionalized performative. On the other hand, if I'm at a crosswalk in New York and somebody yells at me, you are to stop walking immediately, I'm probably gonna end up walking really fast away from that person. So how would we categorize this? Is it an explicit, unhappy, unconventional performative? Because that performative phrase had the opposite effect of what it was supposed to do, precisely because it was used in an unconventional context between strangers on the street. Oh boy, there are a lot of words piling up at this point. But you see how we kind of start talking about all of these side things? For example, how conventional does something have to be considered conventional with happy effects? Like, what if I don't even notice the implied part of the implied performative? Is it still there? Does it matter? Because it's not there to me, but it is there to the speaker. Or which one is more important to this theory in general? So we got all these little scenarios that are described by Austin, and honestly, it's kind of what makes the book a bit long and a little bit boring. We are constantly getting into problems when we try to say, this is explicit, this is implicit. This is a happy performative. This is not. This one's a little bit of both. Like, what if I were to say, I really apologize if you don't like these videos? That is an explicit and conventional apology. But we both know I was being implicitly but highly conventionally sarcastic. So is that a happy utterance? Now, Austin knows that tons of problems are arising. And in Lecture 3, he says, I didn't actually describe all the exceptions and the exemptions. Oh, and also sometimes we might actually disagree on what is happy or unhappy, or whether or not somebody's intentions are actually important or not. Or maybe this is explicit but more implicit to this person. Eventually, Austin kind of just admits that his distinctions and his categories and his rules don't really work a lot of the times. But Austin is also saying that there is a lot to language that goes far beyond thinking about whether or not some given statement is true or false or accurate. Because really, something being true or false, or being represented accurately, is only one of the things that language does. Austin kind of wants to say language is always simultaneously describing and representing and also performing action in the world. Language participates in building reality. Plus, we can expand this idea of the performative far beyond spoken words. For example, we had Twitter ban a president from tweeting. In that banning, there is an implicit recognition that language acts upon the world, that his tweets, all of them, are performative in some way. Language performs action. Tweets perform action. Tweets help build reality, because language helps build reality. Now, perhaps the big grand lesson that we can learn from the book, How to Do Things with Words. Language in use is always performative. Somehow, somewhere, it is performing action in varying degrees of intensity, in varying degrees of explicitness. And also, different people experience the exact same piece of language differently. Now, there are two more vocabulary words that have been institutionally elevated to the official academic classification of totally super duper important. Mainly those two terms are illocutionary act and perlocutionary act. And real quick, remember how at the beginning of the first video, Austin was saying we can move beyond this conversation about how to define and categorize things with words. We can move on to another conversation about how to do things with words. Well, by the end of the book, after all those new vocabulary words, after all those definitions, after all those rules and exemptions and scenarios, you kind of realize that Austin himself is very much stuck in that conversation of how to define and categorize, even while he is critiquing that conversation. It turns out that this book is largely interested in defining what a performative is, even though at the end of the book he kind of just says all of language is performative. And to me, it feels like the vocabulary words illocutionary and perlocutionary, they are distinctions that break down just like the other distinctions that he proposes. And on top of that, the conversation starts sounding like, oh, this is perlocutionary. No, this is illocutionary. Or maybe it's both. Or what about when, etc., etc., etc. And at that point, we are back in the conversation of defining things with words instead of thinking about how to do things with words. All of that is just to say that I ain't gonna cover the words illocutionary and perlocutionary, but I will put a link down in the description below to another YouTuber who does cover them. But to me personally, this book is important because it got me to think about how language is always performing action. In other words, language is performative. Well, that's all for today, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that two-part video series on J.L. Austin's How to Do Things with Words. As usual, I'm Mike. You can follow me on Twitter. Look me up on academia.edu for all my current publications. And don't forget about the Patreon. That helps immensely. This is Mike with The Social Life of Language. And we're done.